Here's J. Warner Wallace to try to convince us that documents claiming to speak on behalf of eyewitnesses are the same thing as eyewitness accounts.
I wanted to address some of the objections I've gotten in the 10 years since writing the book. And one of those is something that you may have heard as well, so I thought I'd take this second to talk about it. And it's just the nature of eyewitness accounts. Look, I can't tell you, that's probably that's the single most common objection I get on our YouTube channel, that you're an idiot for calling these eyewitness accounts to begin with. For a couple of reasons, they'll say. Number one, they are written by anonymous people centuries after the fact. Well, that was the first, that's what I believed as well, as an atheist. I mean, I'd heard that so many times.
I've never once heard that they were written centuries after the fact. The consensus among historians seems to be that they were written decades after the fact, not centuries. They were written anonymously, though. Not one gospel author identifies himself by name.
And one of the first criteria for eyewitness reliability is, was the person really there to see what they said they saw? So for me, the first thing I needed to know is, how early are the accounts? Look, if you want to lie about Jesus, what you do is you wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can say whatever you want, because there's no one there to call you a liar. So if you write this in the 2nd century or the 3rd century, yeah, you're going to get away with all kinds of stuff because there's no one alive to call you out. Of course, if you're writing it in the 1st century, that changes the game.
If you write it 40 years after the fact, at a time when the average life expectancy for someone who made it to adulthood was only 50 or 60 years, and most of the actual eyewitnesses were illiterate, then it would still be pretty easy to get away with saying that things happened when they didn't really happen. By the time someone started writing down the first gospel, Paul was dead, James was dead, the other James was dead, the other James was dead, Peter was dead, Andrew was dead, Simon was dead, Jude was dead, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, and Philip may have still been alive, but they had spread out all over the place from Anatolia to India, so fact-checking by consulting them would have been difficult at best.
And I just needed to know how early it was written. And by the way, you'll hear people say, well, modern scholarship was pretty much unanimous on this for centuries until really German biblical scholarship and skepticism kind of formed the pathway for scholarship ever since.
Yeah, there are lots of things scholars were pretty sure about for centuries that later turned out not to be true. The fact that they were wrong for a long time isn't evidence that they were actually right.
I think these are written early, but I've got other reasons why I believe these are eyewitness accounts. You'll hear all the time people will say, well, they were never really intended to be seen as eyewitness accounts. This is even amongst scholars who are Christians. And so one of the objections I address in the book, and the new sections of the book, is, why do you think the Gospels are eyewitness accounts if scholars disagree? Well, first of all, scholars are welcome to disagree. And the idea that this is, this disagreement is relatively modern within the history of the church.
Disagreeing with Aristotle was relatively modern when Newton objected to his ideas. The fact that an idea is new and contrary to an idea that is much older does not detract from its credibility. Often the reason new ideas are contrary to old ones is because older ones were believed at a time when current evidence was not available. The new ideas are based on the greatest amount of evidence, and the old ideas are based on a smaller selection of evidence.
Now, I think there are 4 reasons why I embrace these as eyewitness accounts. And the first is just the attributed statements of the gospel authors. Look, it's pretty clear that the gospel authors saw these as accounts in which they are recalling data that occurs in a certain order at a certain time in history at certain locations on the planet.
So do Spider-Man comics. Spider-Man comics depict the events of Peter Parker's life in a certain order. First, he was bitten by a radioactive spider, then his Uncle Ben died, then he realized that he should use his powers to fight crime. And the comics agree that Spider-Man lived in New York. It turns out that New York is a real location on the planet. So the authors of the Spider-Man comics were likely eyewitnesses to historical events, right?
That means that it's not like, like the wisdom statements. It's not like the prophets. It's not like the letters. These are historical chronologies. These are historical accounts.
They're historical accounts because they depict events in the same order and in locations that exist on the planet? How does that follow? And even if it did follow, how would it follow that these accounts are eyewitness accounts?
And the only question is was the person who wrote it really there to see it? Now, what you'll see is in the scriptures themselves, there are attributions. Peter says in the letters that, hey, we're not making this stuff up. We saw it with our own eyes.
I thought this was supposed to be about the Gospels. Peter didn't write any of the Gospels.
John says in his own gospel in the last chapter, he says that he was testifying that his testimony is true.
No, John did not testify that John's testimony was true. In the last chapter, the authors of John say, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." Notice it says, "We know that his testimony is true." This says the opposite of what Wallace seems to think it says. It is drawing a distinction between the Gospel of John, written by the aforementioned we, and the writing upon which the Gospel is based, his testimony, the testimony of the unnamed disciple. This statement shows that the Gospel of John is not an eyewitness testimony, but is instead based on someone else's testimony.
That kind of language means that the author at least believes he saw something that he could describe as an eyewitness.
No, you're not even quoting the language correctly. If you read what it actually says, the authors of the Gospel of John are drawing a clear distinction between the Gospel and testimony upon which it professes to be based. Also, the first passage of the Gospel of John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Was the author of John an eyewitness to the beginning of the universe?
But First John and Second Peter also have additional statements in them, like we talked about. And Luke, when he writes in his first chapter, says that he is speaking to eyewitnesses and servants of the word.
Yeah, an account written by someone who says he was speaking to eyewitnesses is not the same thing as an eyewitness account. In fact, it is an explicit claim to not be an eyewitness account.
Now, I've heard people try to twist that in some way to get that. Look, it's clear that Luke was with Paul in the book of Acts.
Yeah, the book of Acts was not a gospel, and Paul was also not an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, and even if he had been, the fact that Acts was written by someone who was with Paul would still not make Acts an eyewitness account of the life or miracles of Jesus. Also, who is trying to twist things, and what are they twisting? If you're trying to interpret an explicit assertion that the author of Luke is not an eyewitness into evidence that the Gospel of Luke is an eyewitness account, then you're the one trying to twist things.
There are even times in the book of Acts where Luke drops into first person. He's there with Paul in the actual chronology he's describing, but he'll tell you he did not know Jesus personally.
So how is this an argument in favor of his writings being eyewitness accounts about Jesus?
He came in that second season, the life of the apostles afterwards. And that's where he learned about Jesus from the people who said they saw Jesus. And that's why he describes him this way in the first lines of his own gospel.
Again, this does not show that gospel to be an eyewitness account. It literally shows the opposite to be the case.
So this kind of attribution in which they're saying, hey, we're authors because we saw them. Now, this isn't true for Mark, right? Because Mark doesn't make a claim. We don't see Mark anywhere in the description of what's happening in that period of time, except when we get to the book of Acts. But we do have the earliest statements of the apostles, of the church fathers, which we'll get to.
Yeah, the church fathers who attributed the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were also not there personally. Those attributions were made by Papias and Irenaeus. Papias wasn't even born until 30 years after Jesus was dead, and Irenaeus wasn't born until 100 years after the fact.
So the first thing I would say is that I tend to, based on attributed statements that I find in the scriptures, the most reasonable inference is that these people saw themselves as recording something and reporting something that they actually saw.
But the examples you give show that the gospel authors were not claiming to have actually seen anything Jesus said or did. You admit that Luke didn't see Jesus, even if he was the author of the gospel attributed to him, which is debatable, and the passage in John you cited as the author testifying to the truth of his own testimony explicitly draws a distinction between the gospel authors and the person upon whose testimony it claims to be based.
2 is the apostolic strategy. I want you to think about this for a minute. When you read the book of Acts, what is the strategy that the apostles use when preaching the gospel or sharing the truth about Jesus? Put it that way, sharing the truth about Jesus, even from Peter at Pentecost all the way through. What do you see over and over and over? I was struck by the fact that they didn't preach the gospel the way that Billy Graham preaches the gospel or describe the gospel the way that Ray Comfort describes the gospel. Instead, they described themselves as eyewitnesses of the resurrection, that they had seen the resurrection.
Again, you keep referring to Acts, which is not a gospel. The title of Wallace's video is 4 Reasons We Know the Gospels Are Eyewitness Accounts. The fact that the apostles say they were eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus is not evidence that the Gospels are their accounts.
That, to me, is very consistent throughout the book of Acts. And that means that the apostles were at least identifying themselves as somebody who had seen this, and they could share this truth as an eyewitness, and eventually could author Gospels as eyewitnesses.
But the question is whether they did, in fact, author those Gospels. You'd think that if they did, they would identify themselves as the authors. They didn't.
So it's not just the attributions, it's the apostolic strategy that you see in the first century, which to me is most reasonable if, in fact, they saw themselves as what they were, eyewitnesses. But we also have a third thing, and I try to alliterate these a little bit for you. AS, the attributed statements is the first. The apostolic strategy is the second. The ancient support is the third. And what you'll see is that the earliest writings of the church leaders, the ante-Nicene church leaders, those who were actually writing about the apostles, writing about the eyewitnesses, prior to Christianity becoming the religion of the Roman Empire.
But after the apostles were all dead.
Why I think that's important is because if you're going to suggest that maybe there's some corruption that occurs when this becomes the religion of the empire, fine. I'm only going to talk about, those leaders in the church that were in the earliest centuries, the very earliest decades. And what you'll see is that in the earliest times, people describe these apostles as eyewitnesses.
Yeah, the question is not whether the apostles were eyewitnesses. The question is whether the apostles actually wrote the Gospels attributed to them. If you want to show that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, you have to give evidence that they were actually written by the illiterate fishermen after whom they were named.
In fact, Papias even is the one who says that Mark's gospel is not even from Mark. Mark's not the witness to that stuff. He's writing this at the feet of Peter, who was the eyewitness. And Mark is with Peter in Rome, according to Papias, and that's why we attribute Mark's gospel as the account of Peter.
Which means that it wasn't written by an eyewitness. It was written by someone claiming to speak for an eyewitness.
In the 4 Gospels. So you have, that's your third AS. The fourth is authoritative selection. And what I mean by that is that the highest criteria for selecting the gospel accounts we have was that they were written by eyewitnesses or by people who had access to the eyewitnesses. And one of the tests they realized even then, and although this is a criminal test we use in criminal trials that I describe in Cold Case Christianity, the idea that they have to be present, which means that the earlier accounts are the ones that are reliable. This has been, when the Gospels were codified and canonized, it was the earliest Gospels that even a skeptic like Bart Ehrman would say that the earliest accounts we have about Jesus are the 4 canonical Gospels.
Well, Ehrman makes a notable distinction between the first 3 Gospels and John. John was not only written the latest, it makes much more exalted claims about Jesus that the first 3 Gospels do not mention. None of the Gospels are likely to be eyewitness accounts, but John is the least likely to be an eyewitness account. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.